watching and listening to a Paul McGuire prophetic update. I want to talk to you about the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations and what it means prophetically for America and the world. As we're speaking, there have been Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in 147 cities across the United States of America. Also, an additional 28 nations have had these Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. Excuse me. So they are growing rather large. Now the question is, are these spontaneous demonstrations? I remember watching the lead-up promotion, and it was very cleverly done. But then I found out as I was doing research that George Soros, through his Tides Foundation, which is headed up, I guess, by two former members of the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, a socialist activist group that goes back to the time that I was in college. In fact, I considered becoming a member of the SDS myself, and then I'll explain in a few moments why I didn't, why it turned me off. But Soros is using these front groups along with other socialist activist groups, which really are financed by globalist groups, to conduct these demonstrations. Now, what is Soros's game plan? Well, Soros's game plan, as he has announced quite openly, is to create a new world economic order, or a new international economic order with a world currency. And the game plan is wealth redistribution, which is one of the primary tenets of communism. And the idea is to transfer the wealth from the middle class, whether you're a middle class European or middle class American, transfer your wealth out of your hands into third world nations. Now, some of you may think that's noble. I don't think it's noble at all, but you may think that's noble. Well, the problem is that this wealth that's transferred gets stuck in the hands of dictators, and it never gets to the people. But what is this really all about? This is about the international bankers, and by international bankers, I'm talking about the Federal Reserve System, and the bankers in the City of London, people like Rothschild and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and so on and so on. This is about their plan to create a one world government and a one world currency. And they have in mind, they've been wanting to do this for a long time, since the late 1800s, they want a radical world socialist government. But here's the thing that people need to pay attention to. You know, I grew up in New York City, and my dad always said, it's probably a common expression where you live too, there's no such thing as a free lunch. In other words, people don't buy you lunch for free. There's usually a string attached. They want something. Well, wealth redistribution, there's a string attached. You know, governments, which have no money, by the way, they only have the money they can get from taxing the people, or in our case, the Federal Reserve, which prints money from nothing. They redistribute the wealth. That means they take it out of the middle class and they put it in the hands of other people. Now, that sounds great, doesn't it? Some people would even say that it's a Christian idea, which of course it's not. And they neglect to understand that there's a price. In other words, as I've said before, socialism or wealth redistribution is the bait, but there's a hook in it. And the hook is, yes, you will get your little bowl of super porridge. You'll get a crummy little apartment, not even with cable TV, probably with an antenna. And you'll get some drugs, and they'll keep you high, doped up, and as they used to say in communist Russia, the government would hire us and they would pretend to hire us to work, and we would pretend to work. In other words, there was no real working, and it was just a facade. This is what communism is, because you see, there's no profit incentive. It's against human nature, and therefore it violates biblical principles. People aren't going to go the extra mile. They're not going to invent something if they don't get to keep the rewards of it. Why should you invent something, work many hours a day, create a new company, create a new product, create a new service, if the guy next to you, when the day is done, is going to get the same amount of money? You might as well both just sit there and drink. They used to have a wine. I don't know if they still do. I don't drink wine. It was called Night Train in New York City, and it was a very inexpensive wine that the winos used to drink. So you can sit there in your apartment and drink Night Train wine in your communist socialist society. Now, these protests are very dangerous, because if you look at the protesters, it's obvious that they have been deliberately dumbed down by the educational process. They cannot think critically. Most of them don't even understand why they're there. They don't understand economics. They think that the enemy is corporate America and banks. They're going to vote for Obama, which is neither here nor there, but it gives you an idea of who's recruiting them. In fact, the Democratic Party is using them to create what they call class warfare. And here's the problem. The problem is that the real issue here is not these banks. I'm not saying the banks have behaved well. They haven't. They were bailed out with your money and my money, taxpayers' money. But they're not the real problem, these individual banks and these individual corporations. The real problem, and these people in demonstrations have not been educated to know this, is the Federal Reserve. And you don't hear about that. You see, it's conspicuous by its absence. And if you want to know all about this, I go into great detail in my brand new 3-DVD series entitled, Are You Ready for the Coming One World Government? Are you ready for the coming one world economic system? And are you ready for the coming one world religion, which will be released soon? And you want to get a copy of that. Also, my other DVD series, American Dictatorship, deals with these subjects also. And you can go to paulmcguire.org and get the books or the free resources or whatever. Now here's the deal. When you don't talk about the main problem, the elephant in the living room, you can't solve the main problem. What is causing our economic collapse and the global economic collapse is not these individual banks or corporations. We must understand that in 1914 or 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Now, they don't teach you this in college and high school, and I've debated some of the world's leading economists on the biggest cable news channels, the biggest cable news channel shows out there. It was me against one economist, or me against 5 economists, or the high-level editors of the most prestigious financial newspapers in the United States and Great Britain. And I'm not an economist. I'm just a guy who does his homework, and I had to try harder, so I had to really study the topic the night before I went on the air and debated these men and women, and I won every single debate. The advantage I had is that I knew what the Federal Reserve was, and my research was done the night before. I wasn't resting on my laurels because I didn't have any laurels to rest on. But you notice that in these debates, the presidential debates, the candidates' debates, you notice that in the television news programs, especially the 3 dinosaur networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, and all the multitudinous media outlets, a frank, thorough discussion of the Federal Reserve is not there. And so these demonstrators can't be effective if they don't know the central figure in what they're protesting about. Now, going back to 1913, 1914, a group of international bankers met on Jekyll Island, and they passed what was called the Federal Reserve Act late Christmas Eve while Americans were asleep or celebrating Christmas. And at that moment, the American monetary system, which constitutionally should be run by we the people and our government, because our Constitution gives the government of we the people the power to print money and run an economy. The Constitution does not allow our politicians to sell out our monetary system to an independent corporation of private, secretive bankers that are not accountable to the U.S. government, which is what the Federal Reserve is. So the Federal Reserve seized control unconstitutionally of our monetary supply. And they've been running it ever since. Charles Lindbergh, the guy who flew the Spirit of St. Louis and later on became a senator, said that in the future inflation and recession and depression would all be scientifically created, and he's correct, because the Federal Reserve at will can create inflation, recession, depression. They create interest rates, and so they can rig the entire game that you and I are forced to play. But here's the interesting thing about the Federal Reserve that none of our politicians will admit publicly, and no one will discuss on these television news programs, and that is that the Federal Reserve is a private company of independent bankers, and even though it uses the word federal, it has nothing to do with the federal government. It's a private corporation. By law, they control our monetary supply. They print all the money, but they don't have to give out their budget to Congress or the president. They don't have to say who their membership is, and they don't have to say what they did with the money. Why? Because they're private, and by law, because our politicians sold us out, they control the monetary system in the United States of America. And that's why people are horrified when they discover that the Fed spent trillions of dollars of American taxpayer money not stimulating the U.S. economy, but propping up foreign banks with U.S. taxpayers' money. So unless you understand the role of the Fed, you can't fix the economic problems. Now the question has to be asked, why don't our politicians or candidates talk about it? Well, number one is they are controlled by a corporate-controlled media. The same corporations, or the same international bankers, I should say, the big money, that owns all the networks in the media, also owns the Federal Reserve. So if you dare to talk about the Federal Reserve System on a big-time news network, you'll be kicked off the air, or they'll go to another person. They don't allow discussion. They want to keep Americans in the dark. And so you can't fix the problem. Let's take the current economic collapse. And I deal with this in my book, The Day the Dollar Died. Everybody says that, gee, this caught us by a surprise. Nobody anticipated that it was going to happen. Well, phooey. George Soros knew it was going to happen. He diversified his investments before the great economic meltdown of 2008. And he made billions of dollars during the economic crisis of 2008. Other Federal Reserve bankers or chairmen also made billions of dollars because they had, to one extent or another, inside information.